Happy New Year. Welcome to our very first show of 2024, Radio Tipping Point. Mike Boyle. And our show today is titled Limits to Causing. And we tend to think that we move from one year to the next, and it's like we're switching gears in a car, as if we can, let's call 23 getting out of reverse, and we can go straight into fourth gear or even fifth gear. But it doesn't quite work out that way, in spite of our best efforts. And we realize this later on. As we entered the new year with all this energy, and by about the middle of January, you feel yourself running out of steam. And so I will not make that mistake. I will not live under that illusion. No. And within this title, Limits to Causing, it's a mashup of three different ideas, two very closely related to each other. Well, actually, they're all related to each other in some fashion. First one is continuation of where we left 23 off on. 'Tis the season to play victim. And as I might have mentioned a few times, I'm never quite sure how these shows are going to turn out. I have an idea in my head. I come into the studio, I dwell on whatever thoughts I might have prior to the show, and then we go live, and then it takes on a different form. So in the middle of the last show that we had for 23, I came up with this offbeat idea, very much tied to not just to victimhood, but to the issue that we continue, regardless of our intentions, we seem to only have time for the symptoms. And we deal with the symptoms, and very often a number of us have difficulties seeing past those symptoms, but regardless. So we deal with the symptoms and we cross it off our list. And then we're surprised. We're surprised when it comes back. And so about the end of the show, I came up with this idea of taking January and proclaiming January to be Global Root Cause Month. And I actually did. And so part of what we'll be covering today will be tied to these ideas in relation to Root Cause Month. But there's another part, and very often it's up to Kismet, the way things will work out. And I'm trying one more time to go through Limits of Growth from Donella Meadows. And there's a book that came out in the early 70s and was a seminal book, highly recommended. Obviously, the relevance hasn't changed, and that is a very unfortunate statement. It is as relevant as it was when the book originally came out. And Donella talks about not just ecological points, but she raises the social as well. And so we'll continue in that tradition, and I thought that to take the idea limits to growth and this idea of root cause, that perhaps if I could put a note in somebody's suggestion box, unfortunately I can't do that for Donella anymore, the idea of limits to causing, because that's really what we're trying to do. We want to stop these things from taking place. So our concentration needs to be on limiting that part. And so I'll try as best I can to get through as many of the meaningful points, and I don't discount that possibility that I might go a little bit off-road. And in fact, there was a point or a subject that I hadn't covered so far that immediately raised its head while I was thinking about what I wanted to say on the show. So let's start with the first one, and that would be homelessness. And of course, we know what homelessness is about, and we see that in spite of everything, the situation doesn't seem to get any better. When I think about what it was like when I first came to this glorious city, which was 40 years ago, that there was probably, I'm sure there was homelessness, but it wasn't visible. And if there was homelessness, there was probably, well, I'm sure there was homelessness, but there was an option. And we had systems in place to, quote unquote, take care of it. Although that was very often tied to the Band-Aid symptom, no doubt. But today, it is truly an endemic of all Western cities, larger Western cities, that we have this problem. A number of years ago, I was working as a volunteer at the reception for a hostel for homeless. And that was a real eye-opener for me. Apart from the fact that it would be a lie for me to say that I had, up to that point in time, much experience within that realm. Apart from the fact that these were all pretty normal people. We keep thinking those people that are homeless are abnormal or whatever. You know, they're the same as all of us. But for whatever reason, they don't have a place to stay. And we know how that one can take place. It's a subject that we talk about quite often in the show, the juxtaposition between the dispositional and the situational. And the correspondence bias where we think, well, they were born that way. Were they born homeless? I don't think so. And very often, the trigger is tied to something outside of your control, and a so-called externality. Whether you lose your job, and I think I'd like to cover that one later on, or if you have problems within the family, or it could be a multiples, so that you lose your job, you could not pay your mortgage, or you couldn't pay your rent, and then all of a sudden you are on the street. And maybe it's not just you. Could be the rest of your family. So we think we all are in agreement that this is not a condition that leads to quality of life in our city. And so we need to do something about it. So it's very interesting in this place I was working at, because there were certain individuals that you took advantage of the opportunity to have quote-unquote free housing so they can save their money. And some of the guests would complain about that. And I'm thinking the whole time, they're not taking anything away from anyone. And once they had enough reserves, then I think it's safe to assume that they will move out of the temporary shelters. For this one place where I was volunteering, they were receiving funding from certain individual within the construction industry here in Austria. And I thought that was quite poignant because obviously you talk to people and you hear their stories. And a number of these individuals had jobs. Yes, they had jobs. And because the shelter was primarily or exclusively for men, I would say that most were in younger years, up to maybe mid-40s, and all relatively fit. And then I started listening to the stories that they would tell me about how they were being shafted because the employer knew that he, and I'm using the word he on purpose here, he knew he can get away with it because these individuals were defenseless. They were all migrants. All migrants. And let me give you some examples of the stories that I was hearing. That they would be registered full-time employees, but they would only get half their paycheck. And so they would come to us and explain what the story was. And apart from being full of rage, that somebody would actually do something like that to another person and taking advantage of their situation. No, we try to give them some advice. But I thought that was so ironic that the subsidies, part of the subsidies that were being received by the shelter was coming from a large benefactor who's coming out of the construction industry. These individuals were working for the construction industry and getting shafted. But there's another side to this equation, and it probably has less to do with the shelter I was volunteering in. But very often we will have individuals that were truly down on their luck, and this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's say that they had pressure in their job, which led to substance abuse, which led to erratic behavior, which led to them losing their job. And then let's continue with that. As I stated earlier, you will have a lack of income, which means that you cannot pay your rent anymore. And let's assume that the substance abuse caused divisions in the family. And perhaps maybe the others And the family felt that there was no other solution, because they couldn't handle this person, was to wish them well and show them to the door. So here you have an individual battling with substance abuse, doesn't have a job, and this becomes a spiral down to the bottom. Yes, straight to the bottom. And then they end up on the street. And you have to remember, all of these incidents that I'm talking about here, nobody consciously makes a decision that that's the way that they want to live their lives. We very often end up in a situation where we just don't know how to handle it. And perhaps our ability to bounce back, to show some resilience, well, that's not always constant either, is it? So this person ends up in the street, and this downward spiral becomes the standard fare. So now they've lost all self-esteem, and they look at this as being normal, and it becomes part of their routine. So they could never imagine that they even had a different life, and part of it will be tied to this idea that we have drilled in our heads, well, this is what we deserve, as if anybody actually deserves that. But that's what we think in our society. So there have been some experiments of taking care of the problem of the homelessness first, so that you can address the root cause, which would be the substance abuse, and understanding how that actually came to be, and unraveling that situation with the intention of putting the substance abuse to the side to understand where you want to be, starting that transition for the individual. But we have this funny idea that how can we give them a place to stay? They are not responsible. We think that they are not responsible, so they don't deserve it. So then I ask you, where's the root cause of this problem? There's another story I'd like to tell you tied to the shelter where I was volunteering. It was something I forgot about, and I was just thinking about it on the way here to the station. And I was working the reception and dealing with all kinds of different issues. But there would be a certain time of the day where somebody from the shelter would go to one of the supermarkets close by and pick up primarily the bread that they would have thrown out otherwise, so that everybody got something to eat. Well, they got more to eat than just bread, but that was part of the meal. And so the meal would probably be around 5-6 o'clock. I can't remember exactly. And then around 8 in the evening, and this didn't happen every time I was there, but became more frequent the longer I was there, that we would get a delivery from another organization saying, oh, we are supposed to bring you all this bread. And then I'm hearing from those individuals responsible for managing the kitchen at the shelter, so please, we do not need any bread. And so I would pass that message on and said, sorry, we don't need any bread. And I would receive the response, well, I'm sorry, I need to deliver it here. So you know what happened to the bread, right? There'll probably be some individuals who would say, well, let's try to finish off as much of the bread as possible. And you probably couldn't look at bread anymore. But more likely than not, the bread ended up being thrown away. And if that was only one incident, I could remember evenings where we would have maybe three or even four different deliveries from different organizations here in Vienna said, well, I'm supposed to bring X to the hostel. And I'm telling them, well, we have no place to store this, let alone it will go bad by the time the guests will have a chance to eat. And I would always get the same reply, I'm sorry, we have been told that we need to deliver it here. And so it would be dump and drive. They would be out of there. So you wouldn't even have a chance to get them to take it back with them. You're stuck. Which is a segue into the point that I hadn't planned for the list, but very poignant, and that's the question of waste. Because we all agree that waste is something that we need to eliminate. Well, not everybody, because there are some institutions that thrive on waste. Now, in all fairness, when we talk about a lot of these things, it's not just black and white. But because of this linear thinking, how we've been conditioned, we think that it is black and white. So when I talk about waste and when I say that there are some institutions that actually are happy that we have waste, that's not the reason why they came to be. They were put together to ensure that we have a solution for waste. And again, the city of Vienna is a great one to look at and how sanitation after the First World War played a very important role. But the problem becomes much more than just the waste. It becomes waste as an institution. So we have institutional waste. We assume there's always going to be waste, so we don't think about how to get rid of waste. We think that that's the way it is. And so we'll have either organizations in the public sector or perhaps even the private sector that will be responsible for not only getting rid of the waste, but very possibly will be trying to perform some sort of recycling, but raising the question that maybe if we didn't have any waste to begin with, that never really does enter the equation. So let's go back to the example I gave you, tied to the shelter, where I was sitting there in the reception, and I could very well imagine that these organizations, because they were not part of the food industry, none of them were, that they were the recipients themselves. So instead of being the individuals that were stuck with the waste, because by that point in time, if you don't know what to do with it, it's waste. Even if it has value. It has no value to you, so therefore it's wasteful. And they were just looking for some suckers to drop this stuff off on. and we were one of the recipients. So another great example of how we concentrate on the symptoms, and we never seem to get our head around this idea of the root cause and eliminating the waste to begin with. You have entered our inaugural 2024 edition of Radio Tipping Point, and our show today is titled Limits to Causing. My name is Mike Boyle, and let's continue with another subject that I already alluded to. But let's look at the topic from a different perspective, and that would be unemployment. And we could even combine this one with poverty. We don't have to, but we can for this particular case. So we're all in agreement that unemployment is bad, poverty is bad. And so we establish different types of assistance, some more than others depending upon where you're living, to at least alleviate some of the pain and hopefully some help in eventually rectifying the problem. And we have made it part of our social apparatus that companies can let people go, and that we collectively take the responsibility of making sure that those that have had this bad luck cast upon them, that there would be some sort of solution. But this issue has a very, very long tail. And I'd like to start with the idea that within companies, and I'm saying this, been very, very fortunate. I think it's important to always realize that what you think happens to others can never happen to you, then think again. I've been fortunate. I've never had this happen to me, but I've seen it happen to others too often, where they have a job, and let's go through the scenario, even going back to school, and this idea that, okay, this is what you study. You may or may not know what you want to do, and very often I think the majority of us fall into some sort of profession. And then once we're in the profession, we start to understand what is the added value that we bring. We accumulate skills, and that becomes part of what we do and eventually who we are. And we put titles on these positions where these skills may or may not be utilized. But we keep thinking the whole time, well, this is our job, this is our title. And we think, well, this is all that we could do. And if we're thinking that, what do the companies think? Well, the companies definitely have pigeonholed you into this role that you follow. And so it comes to the time of where that position has become obsolete. Either there has been a reorganization in that division that you belong to, where that type of activity was taking place. Well, that doesn't exist in your city anymore. So you'll be given the choice to either move to Djibouti or say goodbye. And so you think, what do I do now? Because this is all I can do. Now, when you are 4 or 5 years old, do you automatically think this is all you can do? You probably think about all kinds of things that you can do. And when I think about all this talk that we have tied to lifelong learning, which I truly believe in, the problem isn't that we are not capable of learning. The problem is it makes no difference within that company that you belong to, because they are still going to look at you as being the individual who performs A. Even if you can do A, B, and C. So there's a clear bias taking place. And that's where you end up. Well, you didn't want to move to Djibouti, so you decided that you'll try your luck. And I've seen enough individuals who felt that they looked at this as being an opportunity to do what they always wanted to do, to fulfill their passion. And then the cold wind of reality hits them because they don't know anybody in that sector, because they're dealing with the bias of others that do not believe that older individuals can learn something new and bring added value. And then those individuals become a shadow of themselves. Because then they think, well, nobody needs an employee of my caliber who is able to perform these types of tasks, because these tasks are no longer required. I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity and change the direction of my career. But I was not well equipped. I felt that I was on my own. It would get downright frustrating. And then I start questioning whether I am capable of doing anything. And if you think I'm making this story up, I wish I was. I wish I was making this story up, but unfortunately, it was very much tied to situations where individuals that I met, and I saw this pattern quite often actually, and at the end they were happy to get anything. And then they were hoping that they were capable of actually fulfilling the tasks that they were asked to do. So here is a situation that could have been avoided, certainly in the way that it's done, that we do not take a true collective responsibility for all individuals within our society. And let's not even talk about those people who have all kinds of qualification, but they're not recognized in this country. So they will be coming from some war-torn area. They were fortunate enough to be accepted as a refugee within our society. But then we raise the question, well, what can you do? And then they'll talk about their qualifications from an educational perspective, from a work perspective, the work that they've actually performed. And they'll get the response, oh, that's great, but your German's not good enough, and we don't recognize your studies and that experience that you have. Well, our market's completely different, so we tend to think that your experience doesn't really have much value here. But we have a job as a security guard that we think you would be good for. Or we have a job as cleaning personnel that we think that you are best suited for. And then we continue to squander the abilities of those people that live in our society simply because we cannot put them into that box. So do you see a pattern here? So it doesn't matter of whether you were coming from somewhere else or not. The real issue is being put into the box. And all the online courses and all the seminars that you can participate in aren't going to add to a hill of beans if you've been put into the box. Yeah. So that's pretty much where we are. So let's continue. Let's move outside of this area. Let's move into the realm of criminal justice. So here we work with a model where we say these are bad people without really understanding the motives. And you know I'm generalizing. I like to think there are people out there that will take the time to understand the plight of those that are responsible for these crime that's taking place. Not justifying it, but to understand it. But we work with that tried and true model that we think by putting them into confinement that they will see the light, and then they will be released, and they will know what to do within our society. Some countries are better than others. I unfortunately come from one that's not very good at all. And we cannot discount that possibility that the individual was leading a quote-unquote normal life. Well, let's say they got sick. And because they got sick, they lost their job. And because they lost their job, they had no money to pay for the rent. So that meant that they were sick, they were unemployed, and they were homeless. And they didn't read the how-to manual of how to deal with this. And when the situation gets bad, I ask you, do you always feel that you're going to do the right thing if the situation gets desperate? So they see an opportunity and it wasn't a very smart decision. And they got caught. And they got thrown in the slammer. Well, that reminds me of another story. I'd like to go back to the hostel where I was volunteering as a receptionist. We had individuals that instead of participating in a prison sentence, they were asked to perform community duties. And I would be manning the reception for 4 or 5 hours, definitely no longer than 5, probably closer to 4. But I wasn't the one who needed to perform the night duty. No, I would start sometime late-ish afternoon, and then finish up sometime around 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. But you would have people that would spend the whole night there. And I would talk to them of why they were there. And they all had very different stories. There was a young guy going to university who did something stupid with some friends. I can't even remember what it was, and in essence it's immaterial. But he was fortunate because he was given this option to work it off. There was a young lady who was, I would call it guilt by association. Something happened where it was nothing to do with anything that she perpetrated, perhaps maybe some bad judgment, which can happen to any of us. There was another one that was tied to a marital spat. Let's go back to those that were not so fortunate to work it off in community service. They ended up in the pokey. And they didn't read the how-to manual either. So then they end up completely in survival mode. And let's say that their reason for ending up in prison was very much situational, tied to bad judgment, tied to not knowing how to deal with the situation and really making a mistake. and the actual crime was tied to something much more deep-seated, as it often is the case, either tied to poverty or substance abuse or homelessness or a combination of all three. So if they had not toughened up by the time they entered prison, well, they had to toughen up, because that was the only way that they were going to survive. So that becomes normal. That condition becomes normal. And very possibly, you have no clue how to deal with any other situation apart from that one that you're currently in, that being in prison. But you kept your nose clean, you didn't cause troubles, and eventually your term was over. But your family disowned you. You were probably weak in the job skills area to begin with. And now it's even worse. But to add to all of this, you now have a stigma. You've been to prison. And so that doesn't go very well on a CV, does it? What was your last profession? I was imprisoned. So the incarceration, not always, but often enough, is our solution to the symptom, either being from a security perspective in our society or perceived security issue in our society. But we don't spend any time looking at the root cause, or very often don't look at the root cause. And this is very often tied to bias. But by only dealing with the symptom, and not even for the individual, we make a bad situation infinitely worse. Yes, we make it worse. And we already hear the story here in Austria that the vast majority of those that are incarcerated are migrants. So this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? So let's see, where should we move on from here? Let's take a look at medicine. Medicine. Again, the intention is not to complain about certain industries or certain practices. But what's really missing are two things. One is that we, because of our linear trajectory, we keep thinking, well, if we have a problem, we'll just do more of it. Not understanding that by performing more or taking more or expecting more, that we are making a bad situation infinitely worse. So at the beginning, the idea wasn't bad, but we think that that is the only solution, that we concentrate on the symptoms And let's look at the case tied to antibiotics. Now, I think most of us would agree that antibiotics are a good thing. But we have put ourselves in a situation where it's much easier to rely on antibiotics. And we rely on antibiotics for things that have absolutely nothing to do with alleviating the pain or the sickness within the human condition, because we know that we give antibiotics to chickens. And we keep thinking that we control Mother Nature. Yes, we control Mother Nature. And we keep thinking that, well, if Mother Nature acts up, then we just need to double the dose. But here's some sad news for some of us, that we are not the only ones who are resilient. And in fact, if we look at our ecosystem, it's all built on resilience. And so we have created a situation where the antibiotics that we felt that was controlling the situation, actually we have now superbugs where the antibiotics have no effect. And we don't know how to deal with it. It's the same with pesticides, where we've come up with pesticides thinking that, well, we've solved the problem with the bugs. But within that concept called natural selection, there are going to be some bugs that were outliers who were built to survive the pesticides. And because they've survived, they're the ones that are going to procreate. So the ones that were not capable of dealing with the pesticides, well, they were gone. But now we have a new group who is capable of dealing with anything that we throw at it. So it works with our drugs as well. And this is all tied to a system where it's quite clear that we need to get out of this mold, get out of always thinking there's a quick solution to any problem, and that things are more complicated than that. So if I can profess one wish for all of us, that we would be able to improve in the capability of thinking within systems and understanding that a lot of the things that we do are not going to improve our condition, could inevitably make our condition worse, but we have the means at our disposal to do something about it. Yes, we do. And that's my hope. Come December of 24, that you and me and the neighbors and the neighbors' neighbors and the neighbors' neighbors' neighbors and some of their friends from out of town, that we all might be able to celebrate a little bit, that maybe, just maybe, we were able to address some of these symptoms by looking at the root cause. And if you think you do not have the power to make a difference, I have to correct you right here and now. Because we do hold the wherewithal to address the limits to causing. And we have reached the end. Thanks for joining. Wish you a wonderful week, and we'll be back next week. Take care.